Hi there, my name's Oliver Waddington. I study computing at Furness College in association with the University of Cumbria, and this is my video guide on how to build a PC. So, choosing components for your computer is sort of like taking a test, but it's a test that's got many right answers and only a few incorrect ones. And it's quite easy to avoid choosing incorrect components with even the most minimal of research. Most of your choices will come down to personal preference and what you would like your computer to be able to do. Now, I emphasise the importance of you and your choices, just because when you are doing some research into components, you'll find that when people are giving their opinion online, that they have certain allegiances to certain manufacturers or certain brands, and it's quite easy to become overwhelmed when seeking out too many polarising opinions. So the components we're going to be looking at today are the motherboard, the CPU, the stock heatsink, the power supply, the graphics card, 2 sticks of DDR3 RAM, a simulator hard drive and a solid state hard drive. We'll also be putting all these into a case which most people would recognise as a complete computer. So, you may be asking why I've decided to cover my table in this old purple bedsheet. And the short answer is to protect it from scratches. The long answer is that during the preparation for this video I actually caused some scratches. So if you happen to damage something during this video, don't fret, because the subject of my next video is going to be how to avoid getting in trouble, whether it be from a partner or your parents or any figure of authority should you cause such neglectful damage. So the obvious place to start would be the case. Now, cases come in many different shapes and sizes, and depending on the components that you plan to put into your case, you need to pick a case that will sufficiently support them. So for example, if you plan on having more than 2 hard drives in your computer, you need to pick a case that has more than 2 hard drive bays. It's as simple as that, although that rule applies to pretty much every other component, especially the motherboard and the power supply. Other than that, it's basically choosing a case that you like the look of. So a common term when referring to the physical size of a case is the term form factor. Now, this term is also used when referring to the size of the motherboard as well, which provides a standard so that there's fewer complications. So you know, for example, this is a micro ATX case. So that means that I need a micro ATX motherboard to sufficiently fit within this case. So as I previously mentioned, this is a micro ATX case. Now, micro ATX is slightly smaller than the considered standard size of computer cases. So in the likely event that your computer build isn't exactly the same as mine, there's going to be some changes that you need to be aware of for your build to be successful. I'll try and point these out throughout the duration of the video, but some of them you'll only encounter when you are actually building your PC. I personally like to put the power supply in first, and I'll explain why in a moment. The power supply does exactly as the name suggests. It supplies power. It takes power from a standard electrical outlet, converts it and distributes it to each component as necessary. The power supply is just another example of something looking more complicated than it actually is. Each cable coming off the power supply only really has one component it can be plugged into, so you can't realistically plug a cable into the wrong component. The case will decide for you where the power supply is to be placed. It's fairly easy to recognise where the power supply needs to be. The large open section is to accommodate the power supply's on/off switch, as well as the mains cable. It also acts as a cooling vent to prevent overheating. You can then screw it into place with the screws provided with the power supply, and it should sit nicely within your case. My case has the slot at the bottom, but all cases vary. Usually this slot can be found to the rear of the case. So before we start handling some of these products, I'd like to make you aware that static electricity can be hazardous to your computer components. If you look online, you'll find many stories of people who've completely ruined their computer before having had the chance to build it just because of static electricity. This can easily be avoided with the purchase of an anti-static wristband. You can buy them for somewhere in the region of £5, and although they're not considered a necessity, and I've personally built my fair share of computers without never having used one, they're a pretty cheap safety net, so they're well worth looking into. So this is the motherboard. Now, people often like to use the human body as an analogy for the computer as a whole to understand the function and purpose of each individual component. With that in mind, people often associate the motherboard as being similar to the skeleton because it provides a support system and houses some of the other components within the computer. Now, whilst I don't think this is incorrect, I can't help but feel they're omitting a key feature of the motherboard, which is the fact that it allows each individual component to communicate with each other. It also communicates with the operating system so that the operating system knows which components are installed. It does this through the motherboard's BIOS, which we'll go through later on in the video. So before I insert the motherboard into the case, I'm going to insert some of the smaller components into the motherboard. It's easier to do this when the motherboard is out and you've got more room to work with, as once the motherboard is in the case, space is naturally a bit more restricted. So there are some components, for example the CPU, the RAM and the heatsink, that will probably be easier to insert when the motherboard is outside of the case. So the first component I'll be installing into the motherboard is the CPU, or Central Processing Unit. Once again, using the human body as an analogy, the CPU is often considered the brain of the computer. So the CPU will process every piece of code and data, and it will calculate it all to make sure that your programs and computer as a whole runs as it should. This is where we get our first example of compatibility within components. As you can see, I have chosen an AMD Athlon X4 processor. There are two main manufacturers of PC-based processors, Intel and AMD. Now, I wish I could say that it was as simple as if you have an AMD processor, you also need an AMD motherboard. Now, whilst this is true, you have to make sure that both components have a matching chipset and socket type. So as you can see here, at the bottom of the processor, we have socket FM2. This means the processor is only compatible with an FM2 socket motherboard, which, as you can see on the motherboard, this is clearly marked with the words FM2+/FM2. This means that the pin alignment on the back of the CPU, as you can see there are hundreds of pins that you really need to be careful not to bend. These pins will match perfectly with the socket alignment that can be found on the motherboard. So as you can see, the socket on the motherboard has a triangle etched into one of the corners. And if we look on the CPU, this too has a triangle on one of the corners. So this means that these two triangles need to be aligned for the CPU to fit properly. Now if we lift up this bar next to the socket and gently place the CPU over it and into the socket. Now I say place rather than insert because you don't want to be using any force when placing the CPU. And we just pull this bar down, which may need a bit of force, and then your CPU is in properly. So to prevent the CPU from overheating, we need to apply a heatsink. Now before applying the heatsink, we must apply some thermal paste. Now as you can see, I'm using some Arctic Cooling thermal paste, which is one of the leading brands of thermal paste. So then we just need to apply the heatsink, making sure that both clips on the sides of the heatsink are sufficiently connected to the socket of the motherboard. This will keep the heatsink in place. So, next thing to install is the 2 sticks of RAM. So the RAM will be considered a person's short-term memory. The purpose of the RAM is to store data that the processor might need whilst the computer is in operation, so that the processor can gain quicker access to it. When your computer is turned off, all the information is cleared from the RAM. Nothing is saved to it. This is known as volatile memory. So as you can see on the motherboard it says DDR3. Now this means that this motherboard will only support DDR3 RAM. So the stick of RAM I'm using is from Corsair, and as you can see it's DDR3, which means there's a small set of pins here, then a notch, and then a longer set of pins. So this will perfectly align with the socket, which has the small set, then the notch, and then the larger section of the socket. So to insert the RAM, all we have to do is open up these clips either side of the socket, make sure that the notch is aligned with the slot on the motherboard, and then just firmly push down. Should go in, and then you'll hear both clips snap. So it's good practice to use the same types of RAM in your computer. Choosing the same RAM sticks guarantees that you are getting the maximum efficiency out of your RAM, thus avoiding wastage. With the help of my purple sheet, I can show you a graph that has an easy example of what I mean by RAM wastage. Okay, so as you can see, we've got a visual representation of two sticks of RAM, one of which runs at a speed of 1600 MHz, the other runs at a speed of 1333 MHz. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that both these sticks would just each run at their fastest speed and that would be the end of it. But what actually has to happen is both sticks need to run at the same speed. So you'll find that the faster of the two has to slow down in order to be able to work alongside the other stick of RAM. Now, this will still work, but you've got all this wasted potential that is just not being used. So you might as well get two sticks that run at the same speed, and then you've got no wasted RAM speed. Laying the case down flat makes it a lot easier when inserting most of the components, especially the motherboard. Insert the motherboard onto the motherboard tray. You should see multiple holes for screwing on your motherboard, as well as some standoffs to keep it from directly resting against the tray. Align the holes of the motherboard to the holes on the motherboard tray and securely attach your motherboard with the screws provided. Next we have the graphics card. The graphics card controls and enhances the graphical elements that appear on the computer screen. With the sophistication of some modern CPUs, which come with built-in graphics drivers that allow even high-definition video playback, the necessity of graphics card isn't what it used to be. However, if you're hoping for a more intense use of certain graphical elements, such as video gaming, you may need a graphics card to adequately support certain features. This is a PCI Express x16 slot. It's where we will be plugging in our graphics card, which, as you can see on the card itself, also has a PCI Express x16 edge contact. Now, the card I am using has two DVI ports as well as one mini HDMI port. These need to come out of the back of the case to allow a monitor to be plugged into them. All we have to do to install the graphics card is to make sure the edge contact on the card itself is perfectly aligned with the PCI Express x16 slot and insert it with a mild amount of force. We then just need to insert the screws into the back of the computer to make sure it remains securely in place. So my graphics card requires two 6-pin plugs which can be found with the power supply. Now, it's a little difficult to see them being plugged in as the case is almost full now, but once you have located the sockets in the back of the card, it's simply a case of plugging in the cables. So, the final component we'll be looking at in detail is the hard drive. Now, I've got two very different types of hard drive here, and I'll explain the differences between the two in a moment. So, if the RAM was considered the computer's short-term memory, the hard drives would be the computer's long-term memory. Everything you put onto your computer, from the operating system to program files or even your personal data, will all go onto the hard drive. It's just not as easy for the computer to gain access to it at the speed it needs to. So that's why the RAM is necessary as well as the hard drives. This is a Western Digital Serial ATA hard drive. It has a capacity of 2 TB and is part of the Caviar Green lineup, which is intended to be relatively energy efficient. 3.5-inch serial ATA hard drives have been considered somewhat of a standard for many years now. As you can see, it has two serial ATA connectors located at the back of the hard drive. The larger of the two is for power, whilst the smaller one is for data transfer. Located on the side of the hard drive are the screw holes for attaching it to your case. More can also be found on the bottom of the hard drive. While the platters on the inside of the drive are spinning, a read/write head on a mechanical arm accesses the data on the disk. One of the main advantages of a solid-state drive is that it has no moving parts, which makes it a very durable component. It still uses the same serial ATA connectors as found on the 3.5-inch hard drive, so you should have no issues with installation, and whilst being a lot smaller physically, they significantly outperform their more standard counterpart. As I currently only have room for one hard drive in my computer, I shall use the 3.5-inch hard drive, as they are still considered the standard for modern day computing, and they can provide storage sizes that are significantly larger than any solid-state drive currently available, and are much cheaper to purchase. Your chosen case and the room available inside will determine the easiest way to install your hard drive. You may find it easier to screw your hard drive into the bay and then insert the cables afterwards. As I have limited space, it's actually easier for me to insert both the power and data serial ATA cables and then align up the screw holes on the hard drive with the holes within the case. All that's left to do after that is securely screw the hard drive into position. So, that is how you build a PC. As you can see, I found a nice little home for my computer. I've plugged in a mouse, a keyboard and this TV, so all that's left now is to turn it on and see if it works. Oh, not again. A vital thing to check before the initial turn on of your PC is the voltage setting on the power supply. Some power supplies come with a switch that enables them to be set for either 110 volts or 240 volts. It's something you may not encounter, but if the switch is set to 110 volts when you turn on your computer, it will blow the power supply, as I've just done. As you can see, I found an alternative computer to show you this next part of the computer building process. To get your computer up and running, you'll need to choose and install an operating system. You may recognise from the screen that I have chosen Windows 8. This can be installed using either a USB pen drive or a DVD installation disc, which will require a DVD drive to be installed into your computer. If you wish to include a DVD drive, you can simply follow the same method used to install the hard drive earlier in the video, as common optical drives also use serial ATA connectors. There are three programs I'd like to show you that provide valuable information regarding your computer that can only be found by using such tools, all of which are free to download. The first program is called NovaBench. NovaBench is one of many benchmarking tools that are designed to test the components within your computer to not only make sure that they are running correctly, but it will also tell you how well they are performing. You can even compare your results to other people's to find out if your benchmark score is as good as those who also have similar components to your own. The second program is called CPU ID. This program gathers information on some of the main components within your computer. As you can see, it can give you details on each component, just in case there is a particular component you are somewhat worried about. And last but certainly not least is HW Monitor, or Hardware Monitor. This is the program I will probably use the most out of the three. Hardware Monitor can provide useful information such as the voltage that each component is currently getting, as well as the current temperature of each component. Okay, so thanks for watching. I hope you found this video somewhat informative, and I wish you the best of luck with the upcoming computer build. Thank you very much. Bye now.